Welcome to Deschutes Public Library's online programming. I'm Liz Goodrich, part of the Community Relations team. And before I introduce today's speakers, just a couple of things. Today's presentation is part of our series during the month of September called Know Us, where we are exploring the diversity of the people and the places of Oregon. So thanks for joining us. Also, at the end of today's recording, there is a link to an online survey. We are very interested in what you have to say, your impressions of the program, and what your ideas for what you'd like to see the library do regarding programming. So we have invited Albert Wright and Anne-Marie Hamlin to join us here today in conversation. Last month, we had a community conversation where we were talking about race, and Anne-Marie and Albert presented at that presentation as well. And because it was limited to a specific group of people, we invited them to record their remarks again. They were so powerful in that meeting, and we wanted everybody to be able to experience their thoughts and feelings about race. I'd like to introduce Albert Wright. He moved from Oceanside, California to Bend in March of 1975, seeking a new beginning for his family. He began working for UPS in 1978 as a driver. 2 years later, he was promoted to supervisor. During his employment at UPS, he served as the first Black region engineering manager, the first Black engineering coordinator, and global engineering manager. Throughout his career, Albert consistently gave of his time to organizations that help others. He sat on the boards of United Way, Big Brothers Big Sisters, and CASA. He also served as board chair for the Family Connection Partnership of Georgia, serving needy children and families throughout the state. Albert is married to his wife of 37 years, Denise. Together they have 5 daughters and 3 grandchildren. I'd also like to introduce Anne-Marie Hamlin. She is an instructional dean at Central Oregon Community College in Bend. Formerly a faculty member, she taught first-year composition, technical writing, and African American, Asian American, and other American literatures. Active in campus diversity initiatives, she received COCC's Diversity Achievement Award in 2018 for making valuable contributions to the campus community in a way that supports and fosters a respectful and inclusive multicultural environment. Anne-Marie and her partner have 2 college-age daughters, and they live in Bend. So we're going to start with Albert.
Let's talk about race. It's a very difficult subject to talk about, and I'd like everyone to know and understand that you should not take this personal. It's my attempt to explain to you how we got where we are today. In 1619, the first slaves arrived in this country. They arrived at Point Comfort in Virginia, which was a colony in the United States. By 1860, there were an estimated 4 million slaves in this country. Our Declaration of Independence was penned partly by Thomas Jefferson, and signed on July 4th, 1776, he penned the following: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Upon signing the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson went back to his quarters where his slave servants waited on him hand and foot. So did those words about all men being created equal really apply to people like me? Or were they just words on a piece of paper? White privilege started very, very early in this country, but one of the things that bothers me as an adult as I read the Declaration of Independence is that as a child, I was taught to celebrate Independence Day, even though that independence didn't include me. In September of 1858, Abe Lincoln in a speech said, "I am not for, nor have I ever been, for bringing about in any way the social and political equality of Black and white races." This was Abe Lincoln. Again, During the war, Abe Lincoln called the Black leaders into the White House, and he said to them, I intend to free the slaves, but when I do, I want to offer you free passage back to Africa, Liberia, the Caribbean. Just leave the country. This is Abraham Lincoln. The Black leaders refused and said, this is our country. This is where we live. This is our home. We intend to stay. And the history shows what Abe Lincoln truly did. But then after his assassination, in 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes was running for president. And at this time, there were soldiers in the South helping to maintain peace and to protect the freed slaves. Rutherford B. Hayes needed the South to help him get reelected. So he went to the South and he told them this: if you vote for me and back me in the election, I will pull the troops out of the South. Subsequently, the troops were pulled out of the South. Rutherford B. Hayes was elected. And Blacks were tormented for many, many, many years to follow. But we should have been lifted up by the 13th Amendment. It banned involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. So new laws were put in order. Laws such as no more than 2 Blacks could be together at any one time. If whites were walking down the sidewalk, you had to step off the sidewalk. You could not spit in the street. And God forbid you look at a white woman. You would be arrested, convicted of a crime, and put into servitude. You see, these laws are put into place so that slaves and Black people and people of color would continue to be repressed. That was a long time ago. Something I hear quite often. Things have gotten a lot better. Well, in 1986, our government passed a law implementing mandatory minimum sentences for the possession of crack cocaine, while leaving lax sentences for the possession of powder cocaine, which was primarily a white drug. It was argued in the US Senate that this would decimate Black neighborhoods and brown neighborhoods. But nonetheless, the law was passed, sending thousands and thousands of people of color to prison. See, these laws, in my opinion, are no different than the laws that were passed in the 1800s to suppress the growth of Black people in this country. At the turn of the century, the Supreme Court voted that we could have separate but equal education systems. But they were never equal. More money was funneled, of course, to white schools than to Black schools. But that was a long time ago. That was the turn of the century. Things have changed. Things have gotten better. Well, in 2016, white schools received $23 billion more in federal aid, while serving approximately the same number of students. You see, white privilege applies to education as well. How about Black wealth? Generating wealth is really, really important. And part of the wealth in this country starts with housing, being able to have housing that appreciates in value, that you can borrow against, that you can sell. Well, in 1960, my family moved from San Diego to Oceanside, California. We were going to move to San Clemente, but you see, they didn't allow Black people to live in San Clemente. So my father found a nice home near Buddy Todd Park in Oceanside. But you see, they didn't want Black people living near Buddy Todd Park in Oceanside. All of the Blacks, Latino, Hispanic, Samoans, we were all funneled to an area called the East Side. And that's where we grew up. But I left Oceanside in 1975 and I moved to Bend, seeking a new life, a better life. When I moved to Bend, I went to rent a duplex and I went into an office with myself my wife, my best friend who is white, and my 14-month-old daughter. And I said, I'm here about the duplex. And the gentleman looked me right in the eye and said, who's gonna live here and how many? I said, it'll be me, my wife, and my 14-month-old daughter. The gentleman looked at me and said, no, we don't rent to your kind of people, because everywhere you people go, there's trouble. I told him that he could rent it to me today, or I would own it tomorrow. He acquiesced. But you say, that was a long time ago. Surely things have changed. Well, in 1989, my family and I were moved to New Jersey. We moved into a new neighborhood. And I came to find out that when we moved into the neighborhood community had a meeting to talk about this Black family that had moved into their neighborhood and what they were going to do about it. And figuring out there was nothing they could do about it, what they decided was to ignore us. Don't speak to them, don't include them in any neighborhood activities. Yes, we did make a few friends, and we continued to thrive, but we refused to give up. You see, we couldn't build wealth. When I was a young boy, we had an insurance man that would come by our house once a month, and he would pick up the fees for the insurance that my parents carried. And I remember very, very well, his name was Sonny. He drove a green Volkswagen Bug, which I thought was pretty neat. And he said to my father these words, Mr. Wright, I'm gonna sell you an insurance policy the average Negro can't buy. You see, what few of you understand is that insurance companies didn't sell policies to Black people that would allow them to accrue wealth. We were supposed to stay poor. But if you do accrue enough wealth and you get to go to college and you graduate, well, chances are you'll be paid 20% less than the white college graduate with the same degree for the same job. You see, white privileges apply to higher education as well. There are too many instances of driving while Black that I could tell you, too many. I could fill up this entire segment just with driving while Black. I was driving to work one morning in New Jersey, went over the Raritan Bridge. I was pulled over, and the officer came to the passenger side window, which was rolled down, and he looked at me. He unsnapped his holster, put his hand on his revolver, and said, license and registration, please. I said, is this police policy? He said, this is my policy. So I gave him my license and registration. He went back, he checked it, he came back to the car, and he said to me, now, I want you to open your ashtray. And I said, I don't have to open my ashtray. He said, get out of the car. All the time, his hand on his revolver. I get out of the car, he searches my entire car, has me open the trunk, searches my trunk. I'm a businessman on my way to work, and I'm being searched alongside the road by an officer who's had his hand on his revolver. Another instance is we moved to Louisiana for a short period of time, and it was the Saturday before Easter in 2000. Never forget this day. But it's tough to get a haircut on Saturday before Easter. And when I got there, there was a lineup. So I signed up and I needed to buy a golf bag. So I asked the barber where the sporting goods store was, and I drove to the sporting goods store. And on my way to the sporting goods store, I saw on the right-hand side a police officer parked. I looked at my speed. I was going 35. The speed limit was 45. I thought, no problem. As soon as I passed the officer, the car pulled out and followed me. I went into, and I parked in a strip mall, and I went into the sporting goods store, and I purchased a golf bag. When I exited the store, every exit of this strip mall was covered by a police officer. And there was a police officer in a car blocking my car in. And as I walked up to my car, they said, is this your car? I said, yes. And they said, may we see your license and registration, please? I said, yes. I gave them my license and registration, and they gave it back to me. And they were still sitting there, had me blocked in. I said, "Excuse me, you're blocking my egress." They said, "What?" And I said, "You're in my way. I need to leave." But little did these police officers know that they were so intent on pulling me over that my tags had expired, because I had moved to Louisiana from Georgia, and Louisiana charges you a sales tax if your car is a certain year of age, and it was going to cost me $6,000 to register my car. I knew I was going to be in Louisiana for a short period of time, so I didn't bother. They didn't even notice. A good friend of mine, Moises Hunt, and I were going to go to the Super Bowl. Moises lives in Florida. I live in Georgia. He calls me and says, "All right, we've got tickets, we've got housing, we're ready to go to the Super Bowl. Why don't I just fly to Atlanta and we'll drive to the Super Bowl in New Orleans?" And I said, "Mo, we would have to drive through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And what are the chances of that happening without us being pulled over, searched, and harassed?" You see, your privilege allows you not to have to take that into consideration. We also have difficulty building wealth through jobs. When I moved to Bend, there was actually a mill here. We all know it as the old mill district, and it's beautiful, but it was actually a mill, a functioning mill. And I changed tires on logging equipment. But when I came to town and I applied for a job, I applied for several jobs at tire changing places. One in particular on Franklin Street, I went in, I had an application. And when I took the application back, they took my application, and as I walked out the door, they tore it up and threw it in the trash. Sounds like a sad story, but the very next day, I had an interview at the Goodyear dealership. And Goodyear sold appliances in the front, and they did tire work in the back. And I was standing in the front waiting for the crowd to die down to get an interview, when a gentleman said, "Excuse me, can I help you?" And I said, "Yes, I'm here to see Jim Voiles." He says, "Are you here about the tire changing job?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Son, you've got the job. I've been in this business for 30 years, and never have I seen a tire changer apply for a job in a suit. You must want to work." That really pleased me, except for a short time after going to work for Master Service Center. I had gone to Brooks Scanlon down at the mill to change tires, and when I returned to the building, my boss said, "Albert, I need to talk to you. The purchaser at Brooks Scanlon doesn't want you on their property any longer because of the color of your skin." So now I was going to be denied work, feeding my family, paying my mortgage, life in general. So I got in my service truck and I drove back down to the mill at Brooks Scanlon, and I asked to see the purchaser, whose name I won't say. And I got the runaround for quite a while, and finally I got the opportunity to see him face to face. I told him, "My boss told me what you said, and there's some things you need to understand. I'm a man, I'm a hardworking man. I'm the fastest tire changer at Master Service Center. I'm the closest tire changer. You have laternals that feed your mill. You have 2 laternals. One laternal goes down, you're at 50% capacity. The next closest person that can change a laternal tire lives in Culver. It'll take him close to an hour to get here, and it will take him 2.5 hours to change the tire that I can change in an hour and a half. You're making a mistake." He called my boss. He acquiesced. There's a young black girl that works here in town, and she works at a bakery. And when she's at the front counter of the bakery, there are certain people in the bakery that will not come to the counter when she is there. They wait until someone white comes to the counter, and then they will come to the counter. And this young black girl knows it. Well, on one occasion, a woman came to the counter and all of the other people were busy and she had to be waited on by this young black girl. She asked for someone else, but she couldn't get them. So what did she do when she went home? She called the manager and told the manager that that little colored girl was rude to her. Well, that was no little colored girl. That's my daughter. You know, we talked about laws, but one of the things that is extremely bothersome is our fundamental right to vote. In Texas alone, since 2012, over 700 polling places have been closed down. Most of those polling places are located where Black and brown people live. In fact, in southern states, over 1,200 polling places have been closed down in primarily Black and brown neighborhoods. You see, they don't want us to vote, the fundamental right to vote. White privilege gives you the option of not having to wait all day in which to place a vote. Look at what just happened in Atlanta. Do you recognize a pattern here? There's something that I don't think many whites understand. When you leave home, you seldom have to consider how to avoid not becoming a statistic. But since I was a very young man, every time I left home, I had to consider how not to become a statistic. You see, things happen very quickly and randomly. So during COVID, I didn't go anywhere. I didn't wash my car, I didn't clean my car, and I finally decided I'd clean my car. And as I cleaned out my car and I opened the glove compartment, this fell out. It's nothing more than a comb. But to an officer with his hand on his revolver, that could be mistaken for a gun. And I could be a statistic. America has yet to come to grips with its racist past, and yet to accept the fact that we are all really just one race, one people. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. Anne-Marie?
Thank you, Albert. Your stories are powerful. They're so important for us to hear, and you've told them honestly and without lacquer, which is especially important for us in Central Oregon to hear today, that these things are happening here and now in our own living situations. So thank you. We are, of course, in Central Oregon. We're recording this from Central Oregon. And before I begin with my story, I want to recognize that we're on the ancestral lands of the Warm Springs and the Wasco peoples. This land was also traversed by the Klamath tribes seasonally. And I think it's especially important that in a conversation about racism, we need to remember that we are uninvited guests in this region. Our presence here is deeply rooted in the racist systems and practices that have forcibly displaced Indigenous peoples and excluded others for the benefits of whites. So my goal is to tell a little bit of my own story, but place it in the context of systems. Albert mentioned systems of racial privilege. And this is what I want us to think about for the next few minutes. I was asked to talk about my personal experiences living with and coming to terms with white privilege. What you will hear will be my own stories. They may or may not be like your stories. But coming to understand my own white privilege has required that I be honest with myself in my reflection on my past. And it also has required that I move away from seeing myself as an individual and more as part of a system. a system that has control of me in ways that I may not have always known or admitted to. So if you're anything like me, your first impulse in preparing a talk like this might be to credential yourself. You might want to talk about what you've done and what you've learned and what you've known and how you've helped people. I wanted to tell you what I've studied and what I've taught and what I've done that shows you what a good white person I am. That was my instinct. But that's not going to be helpful here. What that does is serve myself. We don't need that. But it also reiterates the idea that I am an individual and I am racist or not racist as an individual, when what we really need to be doing is thinking about ourselves as parts of those larger systems, social, educational, governmental, economic, many of the things that Albert referred to in his talk. So today, what I'll share are some of my own stories, and I'll place them in the context of white privilege and systems of white privilege. So in high school, I had a teacher who wrote and directed plays, and his favorite genre was the musical melodrama. You know this one as the one with heroes and heroines and villains, often plinky piano music in the background and lots of stereotypes. One of his early plays focused on the California gold rush, and it was in a town in which the white hero saves the white heroine from the brown-skinned villain, and there's a subplot about Chinese laundry workers who have fake accents and poke jokes at their own expense. Another play was set in a southern plantation. It was musical. The musical interludes provided by a chorus of slaves, and their costumes, most unfortunately, included blackface. I played a white Southern Belle, daughter of the plantation owner. I've forgotten the details of the other plays I was involved in, and that probably is a protective convenience related to my white privilege. I think about my involvement and my enjoyment of these plays with a little bit of horror now. Why didn't I notice who was playing which roles? Why wasn't there a general uprising among parents about portrayals of people of color? But to me, a teenager, this was just the high school drama club. We built sets, we held rehearsals, we staged plays. I didn't pay attention to the fact that the white kids were getting the central roles and the brown and black kids played secondary ones. I didn't pay attention to the characterizations, the plots, or the lines, and how they made the audiences react. I didn't notice because my world made it very easy for me not to notice. My world wanted me to not notice. It wanted me to not question. The strange thing is that the high school I attended was highly diverse. In my graduating class of 56 students, only 13 of us were white. The remaining 33 were Asian, African American, and Latinx. My church, located in East Los Angeles, was similarly diverse. And yet, looking back at it now, there were certainly racial hierarchies at play to which I was just ignorant. Or maybe I ignored them because those hierarchies were working on my behalf. My shift to college, where the student body was majority white, marked the first time that I explicitly recognized my whiteness, at least as part of my identity. The students at my college looked a lot like me, and they had families a lot like mine. Very quickly, my relationships with my Asian, Black, and Latinx high school friends fell away, and I gravitated toward friendships with white students. Sociologists call this white habitus. White habitus is a place and a social setting in which a white person's chances of having meaningful relationships with people of color decline sharply. And this was my situation. It was exactly what was happening to me. I was part of a system that made it easy for me, a white woman, to attend college. Family, teachers, friends, they all expected me to go to college. And my family could pay for my college, as had their parents before them. College also made the learning easy for me. The kinds of writing assignments and speaking assignments that I had to do, they used the same kind of language that my family already used. The texts that I was assigned to read, largely written by white men and women whose experiences were very much like mine. My teachers, save one, also shared my white background. I found it easy to navigate college requirements, college resources, and anytime I had a question, there were any number of family members I could turn to ask, to look for help. They had already been through this experience and they could help me find my way. So while I had to learn some new subjects, I didn't have to learn a new language, I didn't have to learn a new culture or a way of thinking. I was living in a system that was tailor-made for me. I didn't come to any kind of critical understanding of race in American society until graduate school, when I encountered Black womanist writers who critiqued the feminist movement as concerned only with white women's concerns. It was those writers and other writers of color, especially African-American, Latinx, and Asian writers, who helped me understand that their experiences were not the same as white women's experiences. Yet, despite knowing this intellectually, I remained trapped in my white habitus, partly shaped by the fact that I studied under white men and women. I studied with fellow colleagues, fellow students who were also white, and we looked at all of this through our own white lenses. It wasn't until I had my first time teaching job that I began to understand the power and privilege of my whiteness, especially in the classroom. A few years into my teaching, I was giving a lecture related to Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. My lecture was about the attitudes and beliefs about race in the 18th and 19th centuries. And as part of a quote or a paraphrase of one writer from the period, I said the N-word. I did say it consciously. I didn't want to shy away from the ugliness of our past. And I was confident that as a professor on campus, I had already established credentials as someone who celebrated racial diversity, who was an ally to people of color. Even on that day, I believed that I was engaged with my students in honest and deep and difficult conversations about race. I did this in all of my classes. No one said anything during the class period. No one remarked on my language. So I continued with that delusion for a little while. One Black student called me out on it, politely, generously, via email after class. And she articulated very clearly that my position of power made my use of that word even more painful and harmful to her than as if she had heard it on the street. I was blind to the intersection of my whiteness, my degree, my role as a person who is evaluating my students' work. And as it turns out, no amount of allyship or other credentialing could overcome my use of the N-word that day. One person had spoken up, but how many more in the room were there who had not spoken up and yet felt the same trauma? Thankfully, that student and I engaged in several months of conversation and writing together, and eventually we published an article about the interaction. I continued to give that lecture and engage in those conversations, but I never again uttered the word. I moved that book, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, to an optional reading list and taught Toni Morrison instead. That experience helped me to understand that no matter what anti-racist ideals lived inside of me, I could not take off my whiteness and the meaning that it holds for those around me, especially for students of color, in an educational system that favored my experiences and not theirs. Moving to Bend from Southern California was again a return to white habitus, but I'm more conscious of it now. So I wanted to make just 3 quick observations of how I see racist systems at play in Central Oregon. We have a lack of support systems for people of color. A friend who is Black was forced to resign from his work not long ago because of an anonymous complaint lodged against him. He had poor representation, someone that was hired for him to help him. A first-generation college student and new to his profession, he lacked support and resources that could have helped him. We're also seeing the long-term effects of Indian removal. The high rates of COVID-19 infection on the Warm Springs Reservation and the failing water systems on the reservation are just two of the many long-term effects of the systematic and geographical marginalization of Indigenous peoples in the United States. And we have a clear inability for white people to develop meaningful relationships with people of color. Oregon's racial exclusionist policies have made our state inhospitable for people of color for generations. Redlining, educational practices, governmental practices that Albert mentioned earlier are doing the same work and separating people of color from white people. So we cannot develop meaningful relationships that could help transform and change our society. Systemic racism may have had its starting point in previous centuries, but it is certainly alive and well today. As long as I, a white person, have access to resources to help me defend myself when I am unjustly accused, as long as I can drink water all day long with no worry at all, I am benefiting from a system that works for me and against people of color. The point of all this is to remind progressive white folks like myself that no matter what our hearts feel and say, we remain trapped in a system of white privilege. And that system does some deep, traumatic, and ongoing damage to people of color. This moment in our society calls for us to think big, to create new structures, and it calls for some of us to give up some of our privileges. But first we have to see our privileges. We have to admit that we have them. From there, we can get to work. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. No doubt these are difficult conversations. Albert, I was really struck by your lived experiences and the stories that you shared. Thank you very much for that. And I'm just going to ask you both a couple of questions, and I'd like to hear you engage with each other. So first of all, to Anne-Marie's point, we are in a time of reckoning. Racial and social justice movements have a lot of energy around them right now. And I'm just wondering if either of you are hopeful in this moment, if you are hopeful, and speak to that hope, or maybe you're not hopeful.
Hopeful, I don't know if that's the word that I would use, because I've been hopeful my entire life. And as I said, we like to say that things have gotten better, but they really haven't. And with the turmoil that we see today, I see things as getting worse before they get better. I see people who bristle at the very word white privilege, because admitting that means you have to somehow admit that people of color did not have those privileges that whites had. And that's a difficult to admit. So turmoil now, yes. There's change afoot. I am hopeful that change is afoot.
Thank you.
I have definite moments of feeling discouraged. Each time we see a new bit on the news about violence against Black people by our law enforcement, I am discouraged. And I think about what it must feel like to be a Black person, seeing these things and the stress and the fear that it must cause. So I am discouraged by the events and the impact of those events on African American communities and individuals. There are moments when I have some hope. I feel some encouragement. I read recently that some of the books on the bestseller lists today demonstrate that people are reaching out and wanting to learn about how to be an anti-racist. I'm hopeful about that. I'm hopeful within my own educational context about the conversations that I see happening and in which I am also involved about how do we make higher education anti-racist? How do we carefully look at ourselves? How do we change? Where do we go from here? And I see some pretty serious conversation about change that needs to happen, and that gives me hope. So a little bit of both discouragement and encouragement.
Thank you. And so just one last question. Where are you turning? Are there books that are inspiring you right now? Podcasts, music? Where are you turning for inspiration as we keep engaging in these difficult conversations and this difficult work that we are all looking at right now?
When I think about inspiration, I think about, and something that I've told most of my white friends is, your parents didn't have to teach you how to be white. My parents had to teach me and warn me about the dangers of being Black. And that the stories that I have told you today are not the most egregious events that have happened in my life. But the most motivating and hopeful was when I was a sophomore in high school. I was at my grandmother's house, and my grandmother was a very, very proud woman. And everything in my grandmother's house was of high quality, and everything is paid for. And she prided herself in owing no one anything. And I'm sitting at a table, and my grandmother would have afternoon tea with my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my great-aunt Jean, my great-aunt Neva, my great-aunt Eva. All of these women sitting around a table, and they were having tea. And they were talking about the state of the world then. And this was during the civil rights movement. And they told a story about when they were working in the fields, that they would take all of the babies and they would put all of the babies in one corner of the field. And that it was everything that this one young little girl could do to keep the flies off of them, let alone keep their diapers changed. And one of those babies was my mom. And they all burst out in tears. And they told me, son, we have sacrificed so much so that you could thrive. So when I think it's hard, I think about my mom being one of those babies in the corner of a field in the hot sun, barely being attended to. It motivates me. It does give me hope. And it's part of the reason that I've done the things that I have done in this life.
Thank you.
I'm inspired by, and I'm turning to Black leaders in our country. And I'm about to add Albert to that list. I'm inspired by your stories, your willingness to share difficult stories. And I think in your willingness, I'm also, I see a sense of hope. I don't think you would tell us these stories if you didn't think that they might not make a difference. I hope I'm reading that correctly. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm inspired by people who are willing to speak out about the pain and the trauma and the loss in their own lived experience, and who are willing to share those with white people who need to hear them. We all need to hear them. I look to Black leaders nationally. I look to everything I can find by Barack and Michelle Obama, whether it's written or spoken or in podcast form. I find them very inspiring. And then in relation to reading, I mentioned the number of people, books by Black authors and thinkers who are on the bestseller list these days too, that you'll definitely see way up on those lists are Ibrahim X. Kendi and Ijeoma Oluo, who have both written books that I think are being picked up more and more often by people who want to make change, people who want to see change, who want to be a part of the change. I'm inspired by all of those people. And I think that what we need to do now, what we need to see now, is taking that intellectual engagement with the ideas and making stuff happen. I think we need to see more people out working for voting rights, voting accessibility. I think we need to see people changing structures of education, higher education at all levels. I look forward to seeing people translating the work that they're doing in educating themselves, which I think is very, very important, and turning that into action for improving our society.
Thank you. I just really want to honor both of you. These are not easy conversations, and I would imagine that folks who are going to tune in and watch this presentation are going to have some moments of discomfort, but I appreciate you both so much for doing this and being willing. And I thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz.